Okay, looking at Facebook the other day on one of the Blender chats, there was a thing about putting holes into objects. And this comes up often, so I thought I'd do a quick tutorial of the way that I like to do it. As with all things in Blender, there's a million and one ways of doing most things. And this one I learnt from a guy who, again, on another Facebook chat group, and he taught me this way. So all kudos to this guy. I can't remember his name, unfortunately. I was trying to cut holes into a hull at the time to go and get a put holes into a hull, a hole for a hull, if that makes sense. And he deserves full credit, not me. So anyway, so going back to the Facebook discussion, often when people are talking about cutting holes into meshes in Blender, people say use Booleans, and there's nothing wrong with that per se, but it does cause problems around topology, and that's really what I want to cover here, and why you may not want to do it, and we'll discuss that a little bit more. So here we are. Yeah, very, very basic object, but with some interesting geometry to it. If you can see that there's actually a slight curve, if you just go into the wireframe mode, you can see there's a couple of curves. It's curved in both dimensions. So we've got a curve coming down here and a curve coming up here. So not supposed to represent anything, it's just our example object. And what we want to do is we want to cut a hole in it. So first of all, what we'll do is we'll put in a Boolean hole. So let's see how that works. So let's add a cylinder, nice and easy. Let's scale it down to something a bit more reasonable. It's fine, doesn't really matter on the size for this purpose. Let's take that off, and let's move it down to about there, let's say, just to make it a little more difficult. And you can see that the geometry around the hole is quite complex. It's actually moving across both dimensions. You know, we've got a curve around that way and a curve around that way, and that's going to cause us problems, or makes it a little bit more interesting than cutting it into something that's a flat object. Okay, so how do we do it with Booleans? Well, Booleans are quite easy. We go and just use a modifier, add modifier, and a Boolean modifier. So Boolean, you know, in terms of Boolean groups is really where it comes from, Boolean logic. What do we want to do? Well, we want the Boolean on the right object to start with. So let's add the Boolean in here. And what we want to do is we want to take away this object in the middle. So we can use the pipette there, set the object, and that has gone and taken it away. You can't see much because the cylinder is visible. So if you remove the visibility of the cylinder, then you can see it's cut a rather nice hole. And you think that's job done. It's nice in a lot of ways being able to use a Boolean, really, because, or modifiers generally, because it's non-destructive. So we can now move this around. Oops. Move this around. Yeah, and then we've still got our hole. So we can still edit our mesh afterwards. And that is a great thing with modifiers. You know, but it has problems, and we'll see the problems. We can't really leave it in this state. So let's apply that modifier, and we'll see some of the problems that turn up. So apply the modifier. Yeah, that cylinder is still there, doesn't matter. But we've now got our hole in there. And you know, it's a nice hole. You know, you can see all the way through it. Great. The issue is, and that is, we've got these things which are called n-gons. And n-gons are where we've got a you know, more than 4 vertices that go and make up the shape. And we can see that we've got a whole load of vertices here. And we've got some interesting effects. We've got these which should really be, you know, what's that really doing for us? Nothing. And people with this kind of stuff says, well, it doesn't really matter. If you're doing hard surface modeling, then why is that a problem? Well, yeah, and people argue it's not. I argue it is, and pretty tough around topology. I think topology has got to be the best that you can make it, as it ends up being the basis for a whole load of things, including rendering and any changes or editing that you want to do. So unless you can go and build things first time perfectly, then I think there's better ways. So let's look at the first issue. The first issue, I think, is really around just the rendering. If we shade it as flat, doesn't really do much, but if we now shade it as smooth, it doesn't look good, does it? And that again is because of these n-gons. It's because of these extra vertices we've got here. Not neat, not nice. So that's one issue. The other issue is, and if we now want to change this because we go, well, actually, we want it, perhaps, we don't really want a sharp edge. Things don't have a sharp edge in real life. Things have a bit of a chamfer normally. They have a bit of a little bit of shape to it. We can't put in any loop cuts at all. We're there. And there's no nice loop cut that we can put in with the kind of the Control R like we could here, where we're actually kind of looping around the object. So to my mind, it's really not a great way of proceeding. And the next thing that we'll do is we'll look at the other approach that I use, which is really using the shrink wrap modifier. So shrink wrap modifier, really what's that? It's very, very similar in some ways to Booleans. We still need our shape to do the whole with. So here we are, back to our surface again, back before we put the Boolean in. Let's go and add another cylinder. Let's shrink it down, scale it up. Again, it's not a real thing that I'm doing, so it's just for demonstration purposes. And let's move it into a place where it's a bit more complex, where the geometry is. And again, we've got this interesting geometry going on here. So shrink wrap, what do we want to do? Well, we want to use this to make a hole. So at the minute, all the normals are pointing out. So the first thing that we're going to do is make that flipped. So let's take off the top and the, whoopsie. Let's take off the top. Let's try again. And the bottom surface. That's better. And then let's go and flip that normal. So select it. And then we can do mesh, normals, Alt N, and then that will flip it. So now this is the outside of the object, where before obviously this was the inside of the cylinder. So let's flip the normals. Okay, so the next thing that I would do if I was doing this is I'll go and select that top surface, because again, as I was saying about earlier, things don't really have a hard edge necessarily. So what you want to do is you want to extrude, so ENS, and extrude and scale, and just give yourself a little bit of an edge, which is what we will shrink onto the object there. Shrink wrap onto the object there. So that's where the object will join into our hole. Let's do the same on the other side. Let's have the hole all the way through. Yeah, try and grab that. You don't want it too big. You just want enough there. Okay, that's the first bit. It's a bit far off our hole, isn't it? So let's go and just select that whole side, that whole kind of flange, and let's just drop it down a bit. So out there. Let's start that, and let's do the same here. Just move it up. Okay, nice. So again, we're going to use a modifier, and the modifier that we're going to use this time though is a shrink wrap modifier, and we're not going to shrink wrap on this object. We're going to shrink wrap on this object. So shrink wrap. So modifier, add modifier, and it's a deforming modifier. We're deforming the mesh, and so there we have the shrink wrap modifier. And what do we want to do? Well, we want to shrink wrap this onto that. That kind of goes a bit wrong. And the reason it's going a bit wrong is because really we just want that extra edge, that kind of flange arrangement, to be just shrink wrapped onto there. So what we can do is we can select that flange, yeah, and then we can go and just select the vertex here. So add a vertex group. I'll name it in this case, you don't really have to. And then we assign those vertices, just come out, just select. Yeah, okay, so we've got those assigned. Let's do the same on this one, and let's add another flange. Okay, and that's flange bottom. Assign, yeah, and then let's deselect and let's select. Yep, so we can select both flanges. Okay, freeze. That's gone wrong, hasn't it? Let's deselect. That's selected everything. Okay, so let's remove and then let's select. Let's hopefully that has worked, and it hasn't. Great. That one has. Assign. Hey, right. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so now what do we want to do? Well, we now want to apply the shrink wrap modifier just to these two groups. So we can do flange top, and then let's add another modifier because we want to do the bottom. We can only, if you look at the modifier, we can only do one vertex group at a time. So let's now go and shrink wrap again. And what do we want to shrink wrap onto? We want to shrink wrap onto this object, and we just want to do the bottom flange. Okay, and then that is nicely deformed onto our mesh. Okay, and then let's assign it. Let's apply it. Sorry, not assign it. Let's apply it. Okay, shrink wrapped on there. Okay, it's deformed the circle a bit, but that's various ways we can get around that in terms of rotating that hole and things, which we won't do. As I said, this is just demonstration purposes. So now what we want to do is we want to join those. Control J to join, and then that is our hole in there. And now if we just remove the interfering faces, yeah, we can then just do a bridge edge loops. So by selecting the two edge loops, and we do edge, bridge edge loops. Okay, and then we've got our hole and it's perfectly following that surface. Yeah. Let's do just shade flat, and let's do shade smooth. And again, you can see that we've now got a much better shaped hole. Yeah, it's got much better geometry around it. We've got a lot of triangles here. That's because this mesh is quite big. You know, perhaps we'd want to subdivide the mesh a little bit more to go and get more detail in there if we wanted. But now we do have quite a lot we can do. We can, oops, hit the right button. We can go and we can add in extra edge loops. We can add in extra geometry if we want to. It ends up being quite possible to go and and actually play around with this a little bit if we wanted to. So it's a much more useful topology. So let's just do it on the other side. If you remember, we had that, we shrink wrap that flange onto the surface, and then that final stage is remove the surfaces that are intersecting. Oops. Try and get become the edge loop. Yeah, the two edge loops are now selected, and then we can do edge, bridge edge loops. Yeah, and again we've got the triangles. Let's just do shade flat and shade smooth. And again, we've got a much neater hole in there that's following that surface. So that's it. So key things are really that we are, Booleans mess up the topology. What we can do is we can add our hole by doing a cylinder. We've got to flip the normals to make sure it's on the outside. Yeah, and then we use the shrink wrap modifier. And if you remember, we used the shrink wrap modifier and we selected that flange. Let's use this one. We selected the flange. We assigned the group to that, yeah, and then we just applied the shrink wrap onto that to shrink wrap it onto the object below. That's it. I hope that was helpful. Any comments, then please let me know below. Again, I'm sure people say there's a million and one different ways of cutting holes in Blender, but that's the one that I tend to prefer. Thank you very much. Thanks for watching. Cheers, guys.